What is your understanding of where the decision-making process has reached? Do you think the Americans are about to announce that they will send Abrams tanks to Ukraine?
Well, it does sound like they're ready to announce it. They've even got the figure of how many. But and the spokesman there was really giving the dodge to the question. It's nighttime here, as well as in UK, and so I'm not sure we'll see an announcement now, this late in the evening. Maybe tomorrow morning. Supposedly the U.S. supposed to go first, followed by the Germans. So the Germans would be announcing later on in the day tomorrow. So I think we're just going to have to wait and see. It's a bit of a surprise, frankly. I'm surprised the Americans have decided to provide those Abrams. It's going to be a while before they can get there because, of course, they're in the States and they might have to go through some refigurations, et cetera. But what's important here is it's the Leopard 2 tanks. We need to start the flow of them in there. The Germans have a small number that they're going to provide, but maybe the other NATO allies who have Leopards, they're going to provide them as well.
You say it's a surprise because the Biden administration does seem to have been reluctant to send its Abrams tanks. What's your understanding of what appears to be a change of heart?
Well, I guess it's a couple things. One is that they wanted to give Berlin the cover that Scholz says he needed before he can release the Leopards, both in his country and in the other allies. So I think there was a feeling that we had run out of time. We needed to get those Leopards on the field because of what the Russians may be up to in a few months. So I think we ran out of time, and so we had to release some of those Abrams so that the Germans would do the same with the Leopard. But I think also this means that Ukraine tankers are going to be able to get some training on the Abrams so that down the road we might release more. And that would be great. That would be fine. So really, perhaps it's the U.S. Abrams were released to get the Germans on the move and then to begin training on the U.S. tanks as well.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds as though there was a bit of a row between the German and American delegations at that big meeting in Ramstein last week, with Germany under huge pressure to give the go ahead to not only send its Leopard 2 tanks, but to allow other EU nations to send their German made tanks. But with the German delegation saying, well, look, you, the US, aren't doing anything. So perhaps this is a political and a symbolic move as much as a significant one militarily.
Well, I think is the U.S. move resulted in a significant military effect by the Germans releasing their Leopards. So, you're right. I think in some ways, yes, releasing the Abrams was symbolic just to get the Germans on the move. But I think it can be turned into something significant on the U.S. side down the road when we're ready to provide Abrams and the Ukraine military has taken time to do some training on the U.S. small number of U.S. Abrams released. So maybe down the road it will be significant from the U.S. side too. But the Leopards are on the move. We got to increase those numbers and welcoming the challengers too. By the way, I think UK should know that those challengers are well received, and that helped to prime the pump too.
Yeah, the UK was actually the first Western nation to commit tanks with the announcement of those 14 Challenger tanks heading for Ukraine. The timing on this is quite important, isn't it, Jim? The Ukrainians, President Zelensky, and other senior members of his government have been saying for weeks, months, that they fear that the Russians will launch a renewed offensive in the east of the country in the spring or as soon as the very harsh winter starts to ease, and that they need these tanks to try to prevent the Russians taking more territory.
Well, that's right. I think there's two things at play here. One is exactly what you said. There is fear that the Russians are going to mount a pretty stiff offensive pretty soon, and they need these tanks to help blunt that offensive and push it back. And then the second thing is Ukraine needs to be on the offensive too. And we have given them, UK as well as some of the other allies, including Germany, these infantry fighting vehicles that work with tanks. So you would have tanks spearheading an offensive, followed closely behind by these infantry fighting vehicles carrying Ukraine troops. So this is important not just to blunt that Russian offensive, but also important for Ukraine to get on the offensive itself, to continuing to take back some of that land, and to show the West to keep up the support because we're worth it.
You talk about Ukrainian troops getting onto the offensive using Western supplied tanks. I mean, in the early weeks and months of this war, the US, the UK, and NATO allies were reluctant to send heavy armor. They were insisting that they were only going to be sending defensive weapons. Uh, do you think there is a significant shift happening here?
Oh, yes, definitely. I think there's been quite a shift since February of last year when there was a lot of reluctance and concern and worry about escalation. People in the West tried to define their assistance as being defensive, which defense and offense. I mean, it's a bit of a blur between the two. So yes, I think now a lot of that reluctance has left because Ukraine has proven not only that they know how to use the weapons, but that they use them in a very good way to push back on the Russians, not just to defend but to push back. And I think also the Russian actions in Ukraine, the atrocities, the violence that Russia has wreaked across Ukraine, that is also something that has really made the Western capitals and NATO push for more assistance going in there and to want Ukraine to do well on the battlefield.
These Western tanks will clearly help Ukraine's forces. It does look, though, doesn't it, Jim, as though when the weather starts to ease a bit, perhaps in a couple of months' time, there could be some pretty ferocious fighting along that eastern front, if, as expected, the Russians do launch another attempt to try to gain further territory.
You're absolutely right. We're going to see some bloody months ahead. And it's not, I think personally, it's not necessarily along just the eastern frontier. We could see something coming out of Belarus too. I think Russia can be clever when it wants to, and we might see an offensive that's a bit different than we have seen in the past. And so it's going to be a bit of a race. Who's going to be on the offensive first? Is it going to be Russia, the way you described, as the winter begins to ease, or will it'll be Ukraine? And Russia can't even get off its offensive because Ukraine got there first, and it's Russia on the defensive. I don't know, but we're going to see this kind of race going on. But one way or another, it's going to be bloody, and it will be likely quite decisive as well.
We've also seen today President Zelensky sacking a whole series of senior officials around him in Ukraine, an attempt, he says, to root out corruption. Um, do you think that this is perhaps an attempt to show that he is aware of the concerns about that? Because before the war, that was something of a concern. We haven't heard much about it in recent months. But what do you make of this decision to sack so many senior figures?
Well, I think you're right. I think doing this publicly, the way he's doing it, is showing the West and the United States, particularly, we have been concerned about that, and I'm sure London is as well. We've been concerned about the corruption in Ukraine. That's what has kept Ukraine out of NATO for so long as well. There was concern in Brussels at NATO headquarters about corruption. So he's done this in a very public way so that we all saw him doing it. He's saying it's because of corruption. At the end of the day, it might be more than just corruption. Maybe some of these people got crosswise with Zelensky too. I don't know. But I think you're right. I think he's doing this in a public way to show the West that, look, you're giving us a lot of money and we're going to spend it well. It's not going to go into some corrupt official's pocket. That this is, we know about our problems and we're doing something about it.
Just finally, Jim, we're seeing that attempt by Zelensky to try to clean up his government, what could be a really significant move by Germany, the US, and then perhaps other countries. We know that Poland already wants to send tanks, sending that into Ukraine. Are we heading perhaps towards a decisive phase in this war? Or could we just see, as you were saying, a really bloody stage of fighting which perhaps doesn't change that much in terms of what is happening on the ground.
Well, I think that's what we're going to have to wait and see. I think we know it's going to be bloody. We know it's coming. If nothing happens as a result of the fighting and it remains a stalemate, that tells us something too. That tells us we're in for a long war. It tells us that we have got to do more to give Ukraine an edge so that they can get over the stalemate. But we could see it could be decisive, whether on the Russia side or on the Ukraine side. It could be decisive if, for instance, Ukraine is able to pull off some maneuvers, such as we saw during the summer, where they're able to really humiliate that Russian army and really capture so much of the Donbas back. If we see that over time, that certainly would be decisive. Will we see that? I don't know. We're going to have to wait and see. The Russian army is also replenishing itself with recruits that aren't very well trained, but they're there and probably poorly armed. But the thing is, they are in the way, and so we're gonna see something this summer that is going to be bloody, and we're going to have to wait and see if it moves the needle or not.